The valet's hand brushed mine as he placed the Lexus keys gently in my palm. And called me, ma'am. Still, I heard my son's voice echo from brunch, laughing loud enough for his friends to look. As I turned, the engine purred behind me, 20 years old and more faithful than family. The same smirk he wore when he said, "She won't let it go." That's when I smiled, because neither would the title. It still read Eleanor Masters, and I drove off slow, so they'd see who the car, and the house, belonged to. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. Eleanor turned the key, the familiar purr of her '99 Lexus reassuring her as the car coasted up the palm-lined driveway. It wasn't a sleek, shiny machine, but it had carried her for 20 years, more faithfully than most people. The light from the afternoon sun gleamed off the faded silver paint, casting a dull reflection on the polished stone steps of the restaurant. The valet stand was positioned just beyond the archway, framed by the crisp, white walls of the Montecito brunch spot. She slowed to a stop, a soft sigh escaping her lips as the valet approached. He was a younger man, dark-haired, sharp-eyed, the kind who remembered faces, even cars. He leaned in with a grin. "Still runs like a champ, huh?" he asked with a chuckle. Eleanor smiled, a slight lift of her brows. "It gets me where I'm going," she replied simply. The valet grinned wider, almost as if acknowledging some silent bond shared between them. He took her keys, his hands steady and practiced as he opened her door. "Enjoy your meal, Mrs. Masters." Eleanor nodded. The word "Mrs." lingering in the air like a soft accolade, something she'd earned long ago. She straightened her jacket, took a deep breath, and stepped out of the car. Her heels clicked firmly against the stone, a sound as familiar as the creak of the Lexus door. Inside, the restaurant was bustling with voices and clinking glasses. The air was thick with the scent of freshly brewed coffee and pastries. Eleanor walked through the narrow corridor toward the private dining room where Ryan and Kendra waited, her pace measured, each step deliberate. She could feel the eyes on her as she entered, but she kept her gaze forward, practiced in the art of not needing to prove herself. Ryan stood up, his smile wide but tinged with something else. He looked at her from across the table, his gaze flicking over her and then to the car outside, before he made his move. A calculated, casual comment that could have been meant for just her, but which would echo around the room. "Still dragging that relic around?" he said loudly, his voice rich with that easy arrogance he always wore, like a suit tailored to perfection. The words came out smooth, an effortless jab to the air. Laughter erupted from the guests seated around the table, the kind of laugh that didn't seem so much like joy as it did acknowledgement, the kind of laughter that came from people who believed they were in on some shared joke. Kendra's smirk was the sharpest, her lips curling with that familiar satisfaction, the one she reserved for moments when she could subtly assert control. Eleanor, however, said nothing. She placed her napkin on her lap with precision, offering the barest smile as she sat down at the table. The silence that followed her entrance felt heavy, laden with all the things that went unsaid. But she wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of reacting. Instead, she placed her hands neatly on the table, her fingers aligned, steady. "It gets me where I'm going," she said calmly, the words soft but edged with something else. Perhaps something Ryan hadn't noticed. She sipped her water, the crystal glass cool in her hand. The hum of conversation resumed, but her mind wasn't really there anymore. Ryan's eyes flickered briefly, something almost like irritation crossing his face, but it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. He leaned back in his chair, the posture of someone who had no use for subtlety, who was too caught up in his own reflection to care about the cracks around him. Kendra, ever the opportunist, seized the moment to change the subject, her voice smooth like velvet, but sharp beneath the surface. "So, Eleanor," she began, as if the car had never been mentioned, "have you thought about updating your vehicle? I'm sure you'd be more comfortable in something modern." Eleanor glanced at her daughter Noelle, who sat quietly beside her. Noelle met her eyes for a brief moment, offering a small, quiet smile. It was the kind of smile that felt like a secret, a private agreement between them. Eleanor didn't need to speak, didn't need to explain herself. She didn't need to explain a single thing. The conversation drifted on, flowing around her, but Eleanor didn't let it reach her. She knew where it was headed, knew the questions they'd ask, the concerns they'd voice. But she wasn't the one who needed to change. Not for them. Not for anyone. As the brunch continued, her thoughts lingered on the drive over, on the valet's quiet respect, and on the Lexus, a relic, as Ryan had called it. Perhaps. But it had been her choice, her responsibility, for so long. It had taken care of her. And now, she would take care of it. She set down her fork and glanced at Ryan once more. His brow furrowed as he leaned forward to engage the next guest in conversation, oblivious to the weight of the moment. The Lexus outside wasn't just a car, after all. And it wasn't just a matter of taste, or image, or even nostalgia. It was something much deeper. Something that would soon become very clear. But for now, Eleanor simply smiled, the faintest edge of triumph in her gaze. Eleanor's former home loomed in the distance as she drove past it, her Lexus humming softly on the warm Santa Barbara afternoon. The white stone pillars at the entrance stood as they always had, unyielding and strong, but she couldn't help but notice how the large magnolia tree in the front yard had been trimmed more aggressively. The once thick, protective canopy now more sparse, more curated. Kendra had always had a particular way of shaping things. Eleanor could see the subtle changes even from here, the fresh paint on the shutters, the stone pathway leading up to the door, now edged with sharp lines and new landscaping that didn't quite fit. It was all very polished, like everything Kendra touched. Perfectly manicured, but with none of the warmth that had once made this house feel like home. She slowed her car as she passed the gates, then turned onto a side street where she could park out of sight. She didn't need to go inside to know what she would find. The house, once full of her memories, now belonged to Ryan and Kendra. Technically, it had been her gift to them, the result of an agreement made 10 years ago. A loan, she'd called it then. They'd needed a place, and she'd let them stay, under the condition that they could make it their own. In truth, she'd believed the arrangement was temporary, that they'd eventually buy something of their own. But here they were, still in the house, all these years later. Her fingers gripped the steering wheel for a moment before she let go. It was strange to think of them living there now, especially with the changes Kendra had made. Kendra's obsession with appearances had never stopped, not even here. The door of the house opened with a creak. Eleanor didn't need to look to know it was Leon. His car was parked across the driveway, the same nondescript sedan he always drove when he came to see her. She stepped out of the car, smoothing her jacket as she moved toward the front steps. She had been to this house countless times, but today, everything felt different. She rang the doorbell. The door opened a moment later and Leon was there, as he always was, with his steady presence. His eyes, sharp but calm, took in the sight of her, his gaze flicking briefly to her Lexus parked down the street. "Good to see you, Eleanor," he said, stepping aside so she could enter. She nodded, glancing around. The foyer had been updated, of course. Gone were the familiar pictures on the walls, now replaced with modern art, stark and cold. The rich wood floors had been replaced with light-colored tiles. "I was just thinking about the changes," she said quietly as she stepped further inside. "Kendra's touch, I assume? Leon gave a small, knowing smile. She's certainly done her part. They moved into the living room, where the curtains had been replaced with sleek, sheer fabrics, the kind that let in light, but erased all sense of privacy. The furniture was new, of course, not a single thread of the old pieces that had once been scattered through the space. But Eleanor had known from the beginning this wasn't truly their home. Not really. She took a seat, crossing her legs neatly. Leon leaned against the mantel, his posture casual but attentive. I just spoke to the assessor's office again, Leon said, pulling a small envelope from his jacket pocket and handing it to her. Title's still in your name, Eleanor. Everything's still set up just as you left it. Eleanor stared at the envelope, the sharp corners of it biting into her palm as she held it. Good, she said, her voice steady. Let's start moving things. Leon nodded, his expression unreadable. He didn't need to ask what she meant. He knew. You know, Leon continued, his voice lowering just slightly, you've paid the property taxes every year. Quietly, as if you were just waiting for something. Eleanor turned the envelope over in her hands, tracing the seal with her finger. I don't mind paying the taxes, she replied simply, eyes flicking to the new decor in the room. I never intended to let go of the house. Leon's eyes met hers, his brow furrowing ever so slightly. You're sure about this? Once it's moved, there's no going back. Eleanor smiled, a soft, almost imperceptible curve of her lips. I'm certain. She leaned back in her chair, her eyes traveling over the room once more, as if she could pull the memories from the walls and reclaim them. Ryan and Kendra, with their pristine upgrades and polished surfaces, didn't understand. This house wasn't just a piece of property. It was a marker, a declaration, and now it was time to make that clear. Leon seemed to sense the finality in her words, the weight behind them. He nodded once, then moved to the desk in the corner, retrieving a small notebook and writing something down. I'll take care of it, he said. All the paperwork will be filed, the trust documents updated, and the transfers put in motion. I'll make sure it's clean. Eleanor didn't respond immediately. She could already feel the wheels turning in her mind, could already hear the echoes of Ryan's laughter from that brunch, his mockery of her car, of her choices. And now this house, her home, the one place that had belonged to her for so long. I never meant to loan them anything, she said at last, almost as if speaking to herself. It was always meant to be mine. They just didn't know it yet. Leon looked up from his notebook, his gaze sharp. And Noelle? He asked. Eleanor's lips tightened into a thin line. Noelle will know everything soon enough. There was a pause, a brief silence that lingered between them. Then Eleanor stood, her posture once again measured, her expression calm. I'll leave the rest to you, she said quietly. But I expect it done right. No more half measures. Leon nodded, his expression steady. Of course. It's already in motion. Eleanor turned and headed for the door. The sun was lower now, casting long shadows across the room, but as she stepped out, she couldn't shake the feeling that things were moving faster now. And Ryan would learn soon enough just how much had been slipping through his fingers. The afternoon sun filtered through the large windows of the living room, casting long shadows on the newly polished floors. Eleanor sat on the edge of the armchair, a soft sigh escaping her lips as she gently cradled her cup of tea. The faint clink of porcelain echoed through the room, a sound that somehow felt too delicate, too precise for the current tension in the air. Across from her, Kendra sat with a practiced smile, her fingers poised lightly over her phone, a glimmer of something like calculated concern in her eyes. You know, Eleanor, Kendra began, her voice smooth as silk. I was thinking, maybe it's time for you to think about upgrading that car of yours. You deserve something that suits your lifestyle a little better. Eleanor's gaze never left the steam curling lazily from her tea. The suggestion hung in the air, as sweet and insistent as a summer breeze. It was almost as if she could feel the undertones of Kendra's words, the way they carried not just an offer, but a veiled critique. "It runs just fine," Eleanor replied, her voice calm but firm, the words coming out with the same ease and certainty as they always did. She didn't need to justify herself, and she wasn't about to start now. Ryan, who had been lounging on the couch, sat up slightly at the mention of the Lexus. He glanced at Eleanor, then at Kendra, as if ready to jump in. "Mom," he said, his voice taking on that familiar edge of dismissiveness. "Image matters. You can't keep driving that thing around forever." Eleanor's gaze flickered to him, but she didn't respond immediately. Instead, she lifted her cup of tea to her lips, taking a slow sip, as if the warm liquid could soothe something deep inside her. She was careful not to let her expression change, but her eyes were steady. Ryan's words bounced around in the room, but they felt strangely hollow now. She'd lived her life without worrying about what others thought. He didn't get that. Probably never would. Kendra glanced at Ryan, her lips curling into that tight, polite smile. She hadn't meant to push him quite that far, but the seed had been planted. Eleanor would know better than to dismiss her advice. "You know," Kendra continued, her tone light but insistent, "I've already looked at a few cars that would be perfect for you. Nothing too flashy, of course, but something sleek, something comfortable." She leaned forward slightly, as if to make her suggestion even more irresistible. "I could help you with the whole process. We could even go out this week." "No," Eleanor said, cutting her off gently but firmly. Kendra blinked, caught off guard by the finality in Eleanor's tone, but she didn't press further. There was a quiet understanding between them now. This was a topic that had been broached, and it was now closed. Eleanor set her tea down carefully, the porcelain clinking softly as she placed the cup back onto its saucer. She could feel Ryan's eyes on her, his frustration simmering just beneath the surface, but she held her ground. Without another word, she stood up from her seat, smoothing her skirt and gathering her things. "I have some errands to run," she said, her voice low and neutral. She didn't need to explain further. Her actions had already spoken. As she turned to leave the room, Kendra's voice followed her, almost as an afterthought. "Well, if you change your mind?" Eleanor didn't reply, the sound of her footsteps growing softer as she moved through the house and out the door. The late afternoon light bathed everything in a golden hue, but Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that things were starting to shift, and she was ready for it. Later that afternoon, Eleanor and Leon found themselves in a nondescript DMV office in Santa Barbara. The building was quiet, its fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, casting a sterile light over the rows of plastic chairs and stacked paperwork. A single clerk stood behind the counter, her eyes tired but professional. Eleanor, standing beside Leon, was composed as ever, but there was a quiet sense of purpose in her demeanor that made the air around her feel charged. The clerk handed over the forms, her fingers brushing Eleanor's as she passed the paperwork over the counter. Eleanor didn't hesitate as she pulled out the title for the Lexus, the car that had caused so much noise, so much fuss in the last few weeks. She handed it over with ease, no lingering moment of uncertainty. As the clerk processed the document, Eleanor took a moment to glance over at Leon, who stood just behind her, his presence a steady, grounding force. "I need you to double-check the title," Eleanor said, her voice steady but sharp. "And the deed for the house as well. I want everything in order." Leon nodded without a word. He was used to her directness, and he respected it. The woman knew what she wanted, and nothing was going to stop her from getting it. As the clerk finished entering the details, she passed Eleanor a set of updated documents. Eleanor's fingers skimmed the papers briefly before she signed the necessary lines, her eyes scanning each section as if committing it to memory. The title for the Lexus was still in her name, of course, and the house, the one Ryan and Kendra thought they owned, was still hers as well. She had everything she needed. Everything was where it should be. Later, as they walked back to the car, Eleanor's steps were measured, but there was a lightness to them that hadn't been there before. The pieces were all coming together. No more half measures. No more second-guessing. And as she got into her Lexus, the same one Ryan had mocked, she couldn't help but feel a flicker of something. A quiet, private triumph. Eleanor turned the key and the engine roared to life. There was no doubt in her mind now. She was in control. The house was quiet when Eleanor returned, the gentle hum of the air conditioning a low backdrop to the sound of her footsteps across the hardwood floors. She moved with purpose, her heels clicking softly as she made her way toward the small, discreet study tucked at the back of the house. The room was lit only by the late afternoon sun filtering through the blinds, casting narrow slats of light across the rows of shelves, each filled with neatly stacked books and organized paperwork. She didn't need to think twice as she approached the fireproof box tucked beneath the desk. It had been there for years. A constant, a silent protector of things she'd built and kept close. With a steady hand, Eleanor unlocked the box, the familiar sound of the latch clicking open a small but reassuring noise. Inside, there were only a few things she needed. The original deed to the house, the mortgage documents, the papers that meant more than just ownership. They were her foundation, the proof of everything she had worked for, the security she'd built from the ground up. She slid the deed out from the pile of documents, her fingers grazing over the familiar typeface on the yellowed paper. She remembered the day she'd signed it, when the house was hers, unencumbered, paid off in full, long before Ryan had even thought about moving in. The mortgage had been cleared in 2009, a full 3 years before Ryan had even considered borrowing the house from her. A gift, she'd told him then, a temporary arrangement. But even now, as she looked over the deed, she knew what Ryan never would. It was never really his. It never had been. Her gaze lingered on the signature line, her own name in bold ink. It was a line of history, a marker of control. A control she had given up for too long, a control she was about to take back. She glanced at the clock on the wall. It was almost time. Turning from the desk, Eleanor reached for her phone, tapping in Leon's number. The phone rang only once before he answered. "Everything set?" she asked, her voice as calm as ever. "Almost." Leon's voice came through the line, steady and reassuring. "I've gone through everything. We're ready to move forward." Eleanor's fingers tightened around the deed in her hands. "Let's do it," she said. The decision final. She didn't need to say more. Leon understood what she meant. They'd talked about this plan for weeks. A living trust. An ironclad plan that would protect everything she had, everything she had earned. She had seen the way Ryan and Kendra had treated the house, as though it were a temporary thing. But it wasn't. It never had been. Eleanor made her way back to the study, sliding the deed carefully back into its folder before placing it back in the fireproof box. She closed the latch with a soft, final click. In the next room, Noelle was sitting at the kitchen table, sketching something in her notebook. The sunlight had shifted, casting a warm, golden glow through the windows. Noelle didn't look up as Eleanor entered the room, but she didn't need to. They both knew what was happening. The pieces were falling into place. Later that afternoon, Eleanor and Leon met at his office, the air crisp and sharp with the scent of fresh paper and legal jargon. Leon had set everything up: the living trust, the retitling of the house, and assets. As they sat across from each other, the paperwork spread between them like a map of her future. Eleanor could feel the weight of it all settling in. Leon handed her a pen. "All we need is your signature, Eleanor." She took it, the weight of the pen in her hand heavier than she expected. Signing her name now on these documents felt like more than just a formality. It was the final step in a long, slow return to power. She signed with steady hands, her signature flowing across the page without hesitation. The Lexus, the house, the accounts, everything she had worked so hard for, would now be tied together in one solid, irrevocable trust. The title had shifted. The house that Ryan had lived in for so long was no longer his. Not in any real sense. Ryan and Kendra were not beneficiaries. They never would be. Leon looked over the papers, his eyes scanning the final details. He was thorough. Always. "Everything's in order," he said, placing the papers back into the folder. Eleanor looked up, meeting his gaze. "Good," she replied simply. "It's time to move on." There was a quiet satisfaction in her voice, something that had been building for years, but this was the turning point. The moment when everything shifted, when everything that had once been hers would now be returned. She left Leon's office later that afternoon, the legal papers now safely tucked away in her bag. As she stepped out into the sunlight, her phone buzzed. A message from Noelle. "Are we ready, Grandma?" Eleanor's lips curved into a small smile as she typed a quick reply. "Yes, darling, we're ready." She slid the phone into her purse and started walking, her steps light, her heart steady. The late evening sun cast a soft orange glow over the city as Eleanor sat at the kitchen table, her hands steady as she pulled a pen from the drawer. The quiet hum of the house seemed almost to pause as she signed the final papers. She had spent days reviewing every detail, making sure everything was in place. The Lexus, the house, the retirement accounts. Each asset now had its place in a plan that was beyond any casual notion of inheritance. She leaned back in her chair, studying the documents spread out before her. The EM Living Trust was now more than just paperwork. It was her legacy. A legacy carefully crafted, meticulously planned, and now, irrevocably, hers. No more half measures, no more waiting. Eleanor paused for a moment, her fingers tracing the edge of the papers, feeling the weight of her decisions. Every line she had signed, every asset transferred into this trust, had been done with one purpose in mind: securing her family's future, but on her terms. The Lexus, the same car Ryan had mocked only weeks ago, was now part of the trust. She smiled faintly to herself. The house, where Ryan and Kendra had lived for so long, was also now in the trust's name, no longer loaned to them. Eleanor had done what she had to do, quietly, without fanfare. She moved to the garage later that evening, the cool air settling over her like a quiet cloak. There, in its usual spot, the Lexus waited. The vehicle she had maintained with her own hands for 20 years. The car was not just metal and leather, it was a part of her. She walked around the car, her hand resting lightly on the hood, the smooth surface cool beneath her fingers. She opened the driver's side door and reached into the glove box. There, folded neatly, was a note. It wasn't much, just a few words, written in her familiar, elegant script. "Things run better when you take care of them." Eleanor placed the note carefully inside the glove box again, then closed the door with a soft click. Her movements were deliberate, her mind focused. She wasn't doing this for herself anymore. This was for Noelle, her granddaughter, the only person she could trust. Noelle was the one who would understand, the one who would honor the care Eleanor had taken, the legacy she had built. Noelle was the sole beneficiary. The feeling of finality hung in the air. The trust was solid, its foundation unshakable. She had built something that no one could take away from her, no matter how much they tried. That evening, she and Leon met once again, this time in his office. The papers were in their final form now, the last of the signatures placed carefully in their respective spots. As Leon made his final check, Eleanor watched him, her thoughts distant but sharp. She could see the shift in his expression as he verified each detail. "It's all in order," Leon confirmed, glancing up from the papers with a slight nod. "I've filed everything with the county. The trust is legally binding. It's official." Eleanor's lips curved slightly, her face impassive but with an unmistakable glint in her eyes. "Good," she said, the word falling from her lips like a weight lifted. Leon placed the last set of documents into a folder, sliding it across the table to her. "You know," he said, his voice low, "this was carefully done. Everything has been accounted for. Ryan and Kendra won't be able to touch any of it. Not without your consent. Not unless they understand the truth. And they don't." Eleanor nodded once, her thoughts drifting to Ryan. She had seen him dismiss her at the brunch, mock her for the car she drove, the life she led. He had no idea what she was capable of. No idea what had been set in motion. "No," Eleanor said softly. "They won't. But Noelle will." Leon paused, looking at her closely. "And you're sure she's ready? She'll understand all this?" Eleanor didn't hesitate. "She'll learn. She has to." Leon stood, pushing the folder into a drawer. He locked it with a click, his gaze steady on her. "You've done what you needed to do. It's over now. No one can take this away from you." Eleanor stood as well, her posture as measured as ever. She looked at Leon, the weight of the finality of the moment settling between them. "It's never really been about the things, Leon. It's about control. About showing them that they can't just take what they think they're entitled to." Leon's expression softened, a knowing look crossing his features. "And now you've taken it back." She nodded slowly, then turned toward the door. As she left his office and stepped back into the cool night air, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out without thinking, glancing at the screen. It was a message from Noelle. "I'm coming tomorrow. I'll be there soon." Eleanor's heart gave a small, silent lurch. Tomorrow. Noelle would soon be here, and with her, the beginning of a new chapter. The one Ryan would never see coming. The air inside the house was thick with anticipation as Kendra walked briskly through the rooms, her phone pressed to her ear, talking animatedly to yet another friend. She had already made her rounds, slipping the news of their soon-to-be upgrade into conversations like it was the weather. Everyone would be impressed, she knew. A bigger house, better neighborhood, something more impressive. It was all about appearances, after all. "It's time," Kendra said, her voice smooth, but with an underlying tone of excitement. "Ryan and I are definitely upgrading. We're looking at a couple of places in Montecito. The market is ripe right now. We'll be getting the realtor in this week to start the walkthrough. It's happening." As she spoke, her eyes glanced over the newly decorated living room. The marble countertops gleamed, the freshly painted walls stood starkly white, and the sleek new furniture was all arranged just so. To anyone else, it looked like a home ready for a fresh start. But to Kendra, it was just another stage in the performance. They'd lived here for 10 years, but now it was time to move on to something more worthy of their status. They deserved it. Her phone call ended, and she set the device down on the kitchen counter. She took a deep breath, soaking in the new feeling of the space, almost as if the upgrades she'd made would erase the years of history that had been quietly slipping away from her grip. The house wasn't theirs, not really, but she'd make sure it looked that way. It had to. The front doorbell rang, interrupting her thoughts. She glanced at her watch and smiled, knowing it was time. The realtor, eager to get started with the walkthrough and sell this place to the highest bidder, had arrived. This was it. The first step in their new chapter. Kendra walked briskly to the door and opened it to find the realtor standing there, clipboard in hand, his casual attire and confident smile ready for business. He stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, the scent of his cologne lingering in the air as he surveyed the foyer. "Nice place," he said, giving the space a cursory glance before shifting his gaze back to Kendra. "Definitely has potential. Just needs a little polish, but I can already see the listing price. This will move fast." "I think so," Kendra agreed, giving him a tight smile. "We've invested a lot of money into making it look just right." She led the realtor through the house, walking him through each room like a curator showing off a masterpiece. The house looked immaculate, a perfect facade. The realtor nodded along, making his notes, clearly impressed. It was all working perfectly, until the unexpected knock at the door. Kendra's expression faltered for a moment, but she quickly recovered, giving the realtor an apologetic look. "Excuse me for just a moment," she said, and walked briskly to the front door. She opened it, expecting a neighbor or perhaps a delivery. But instead, standing in the doorway was Eleanor. Eleanor, in a simple but elegant outfit, stood calmly with a composed expression, as if she had all the time in the world. There was a certain stillness about her that immediately sent a ripple through Kendra's composure. The older woman stepped into the house without waiting for an invitation, her eyes sweeping the space before landing on Kendra with quiet certainty. "Mom," Kendra began, her voice tight. "I thought we were clear about—" "Are you in the middle of a sale?" Eleanor interrupted, her tone polite but insistent. She glanced at the realtor, who was now watching the interaction with mild curiosity. Kendra opened her mouth, but no words came out. Eleanor didn't wait for an answer. With a smooth, almost practiced grace, she walked through the living room, her heels clicking softly against the floor as she made her way to the center of the space. The realtor's eyes followed her, and then Kendra's, unable to stop the exchange that was about to unfold. "You're staging the house?" Eleanor asked, her voice steady. Yes," Kendra stammered, clearly caught off guard by her presence. "We're getting ready to move. You know, for the sale." Eleanor nodded slowly, her gaze falling on the gleaming marble countertops once again. The silent judgment in her eyes seemed to linger before she finally turned her attention back to Kendra, and then to the realtor. The realtor, who had clearly been expecting a smooth walkthrough, stepped forward with his clipboard. "So, are you—" He looked to Kendra, then back to Eleanor. "Are you the housekeeper?" Eleanor's lips curved into a small, almost imperceptible smile. "No," she said, her voice soft, but with an unmistakable edge of authority. "I'm the owner." The words hung in the air like a challenge. The room seemed to pause, the air thick with the weight of what had just been revealed. Kendra blinked, her mouth slightly agape, as if trying to reconcile the moment. She opened her mouth to speak, but couldn't quite find the words. The reality of what Eleanor had just said was beginning to sink in, each syllable a reminder of the power Eleanor had quietly held, the one she had never let Kendra or Ryan truly understand. The realtor, clearly unsure of how to proceed, glanced at Kendra for some kind of cue, but Kendra was frozen. Her expression flickered between disbelief and confusion, unable to fully grasp what had just been uncovered. Eleanor stood tall, her posture unwavering. She had been silent for so long, but this was the moment when everything shifted. The house, the life Kendra had built in it, was never really hers. And now, Eleanor was here to claim what was hers once again. "This house isn't in their name?" the realtor asked, his voice quiet, now unsure. Eleanor nodded slowly, her gaze unwavering. "No, it's not." Her eyes locked with Kendra's, the weight of the words finally landing. Kendra opened her mouth again, but this time no words came out. Instead, the quiet realization began to form, the truth sinking in, heavier than any weight Kendra had anticipated. Eleanor turned toward the door, her movements deliberate. "Good luck with the sale," she said, her voice calm, but with a finality that made it clear this transaction was no longer in Kendra's hands. "I think you'll need it." She stepped past Kendra and toward the door, leaving the realtor and Kendra both standing in stunned silence. Eleanor had barely stepped inside the door when she was greeted with forced smiles, each one too tight to be genuine. Ryan and Kendra were already seated at the dining table, their place settings meticulously arranged, as if this dinner could somehow restore the facade of civility that had been slipping away over the past few weeks. "Mom, so glad you could join us tonight," Ryan said, his voice overly warm, like it was a performance he'd practiced in the mirror. He gestured toward the empty chair beside him, where Eleanor could sit. His smile was wide, but it didn't reach his eyes. Kendra, seated across from him, followed suit, her lips curled in that carefully rehearsed, polite way that Eleanor had seen 1,000 times before. Eleanor moved with calm precision, taking the seat offered. She could feel the weight of their expectations pressing down on her, the unspoken tension that hung in the air like smoke. As she settled in, Kendra quickly poured the wine, her movements deliberate, and Eleanor took a sip as they all exchanged pleasantries, the conversations light, almost robotic. "So," Kendra began, leaning in slightly, her tone sweet but sharp at the edges. "Ryan and I were just talking, and we were wondering if you've thought about transferring the title of the house. For estate purposes, of course. We don't want anything to be complicated when the time comes." Eleanor's eyes flicked toward Kendra, taking in the words, the implication. She could hear the subtle desperation beneath the calm surface, a plea for control, for validation, for something that they both knew was slipping further and further from their grasp. Eleanor set down her wine glass, her fingers wrapping gently around the stem. "Oh, I've thought about it," she replied, her voice measured and deliberate. She met Ryan's gaze, and for the first time in years there was no softness in her eyes, only clarity. Ryan shifted uncomfortably, his hand resting on the table as if it could anchor him in a place that was quickly moving beyond his reach. "Well," he said, clearing his throat, "we were just thinking it might be a good idea to put everything in order. You know, so that when things go to, well, you know, we don't have to worry about paperwork getting in the way." Kendra nodded, adding with a slightly raised brow, "Of course, it's all just for peace of mind, really." Eleanor didn't respond immediately. She knew exactly what they were doing. This wasn't about peace of mind. It was about taking what they thought was theirs, the home, the wealth, the security she had built, and twisting it to fit their desires, their needs. It was never about her. Not to them. But she wasn't going to let them have it. Not anymore. Without a word, she reached into her bag and slid the trust documents across the table, her movements steady and calculated. She kept her gaze on them both as they leaned forward, their curiosity piqued. Ryan picked up the papers first, his brow furrowing as he scanned the first few lines. He looked at Kendra, his mouth tight, as if searching for a word to say that wouldn't sound too surprised. "It's not your house," Eleanor said quietly, her voice cutting through the silence that had settled between them. She let the words hang in the air for a beat, watching the subtle shift in their expressions. Kendra opened her mouth, but Eleanor silenced her with a raised hand. "And it never will be." Kendra's lips parted, but no words came out. Ryan looked at the papers again, his face paling. The house they thought they had control over. The house they had been planning to sell, the one that had been theirs in every way that mattered, was not in their names. Not legally. Not in any sense that mattered. Eleanor let the weight of the moment settle over them, her eyes never leaving their faces. She watched as the truth washed over them, their expressions shifting from confusion to disbelief to something darker, more desperate. Ryan swallowed hard, his fingers tightening around the edges of the trust documents. But we've been living here for years, he said, his voice strained. You gave us this house. You loaned it to us. Eleanor shook her head slowly, her lips curling just slightly, but there was no warmth in the gesture. I never loaned it to you. You've lived here under my terms, not yours. The silence that followed felt suffocating. Kendra shifted uncomfortably, glancing between Eleanor and Ryan, but neither of them spoke. Eleanor finished the last of her wine, setting the glass down gently, savoring the finality of the moment. The house, the Lexus, everything you thought was yours, is in my trust. And that trust? It's not for you. She rose from the table with a slow, deliberate motion, her chair scraping softly against the floor. She was done explaining, done with the games. She didn't need to say any more. Kendra stood up quickly, her voice finally breaking through the tension. You can't, she started, her words sharp and frantic. But Eleanor turned toward the door, her back straight, her movements controlled. She didn't need to listen anymore. They had made their move, and now, it was her turn. I'll make sure everything is handled, Eleanor said softly, almost absently, as she walked out. She left them in silence, the weight of the trust document still hanging in the air between them. The morning air was cool, and the sun was just beginning to rise as Eleanor walked into Leon's office, her steps firm and deliberate. She hadn't slept much the night before, but that didn't matter. The only thing that mattered now was getting things done, finalizing the steps that had been set in motion. Leon greeted her with a quiet nod as she entered, the sense of purpose between them almost palpable. The office was calm, but the atmosphere felt charged with something more, something heavier. Everything's in order, Leon said, without preamble, as he handed her a thick folder. It was the enforcement notice, and it was now in her hands. The assessor's office has filed it. All future title transfers are now frozen without your consent. Eleanor opened the folder, flipping through the pages with practiced precision. Each one was a final piece of the puzzle. It wasn't just about the house, it was about sending a message, about reasserting control. The trust was legal, binding, and now, so were the documents that would make sure it stayed that way. Good, Eleanor replied softly, her eyes scanning the papers. She could feel the weight of each word, each clause. The title would not change, not without her say, not unless she chose to make it. I've also taken care of the deed registration with the county, Leon added, his voice low. No one can alter the records without trustee approval. Not Ryan, not Kendra. No one. Eleanor stood still for a moment, her fingers still resting lightly on the papers. It was done. There was no going back now. No one could touch what was hers. That's exactly what I wanted, she said, her voice steady but edged with satisfaction. Leon paused, as if considering something. Then he spoke again, his tone more cautious this time. You know, Kendra has already started talking. I saw a post from her earlier. He trailed off, unsure of how to put it. Eleanor raised a brow, the corners of her mouth lifting slightly. What's she saying? She's telling people she's been betrayed by family, that you've taken everything from her and Ryan, and that you've broken their trust. Eleanor exhaled softly, her expression unreadable. She had expected as much. Kendra was always quick to play the victim. She'd been that way since day one, pretending to be the perfect wife, the perfect daughter-in-law, all while quietly chipping away at Eleanor's boundaries. Let her talk, Eleanor said, her voice cold now. Let her tell her stories. It doesn't matter. But Leon was looking at her carefully, as though weighing the next steps. It matters to Noelle. Eleanor's eyes softened at the mention of her granddaughter, but only for a moment. Noelle understands. She knows the truth. Does she? Leon asked, his voice quiet but insistent. Eleanor's gaze sharpened, but she chose not to answer right away. She knew that Noelle was loyal to her. The bond between them was stronger than anything Kendra or Ryan could manufacture. But she also knew how easily people could be swayed by the right words, the right manipulation. Eleanor's phone buzzed in her pocket, and she pulled it out, her eyes quickly scanning the message. It was from Noelle. "I saw Kendra's post. I deleted her from social media." A small, satisfied smile tugged at the corner of Eleanor's lips. Noelle was already handling things on her end. Noelle had always been perceptive, always understanding without needing to be told. Eleanor trusted her, implicitly. "I'll take care of it," Eleanor murmured to herself, her gaze flickering back to Leon. "Noelle has already removed her. Kendra won't be a problem." Leon watched her closely, but he didn't push further. He knew when to step back. Instead, he picked up the phone on his desk and made a quick call, his voice low and professional. Eleanor didn't need to ask who it was. It was Miguel, the valet who had witnessed the moment that had set everything in motion, who had known from the beginning what this was really about. "Miguel?" Eleanor said, her voice calm but with an edge of amusement. "I just wanted to thank you again. You were right, you know. I did stand tall." On the other end of the line, Miguel's chuckle was easy and knowing. "You stood tall, all right, even in flats." Eleanor laughed softly, the sound rich with satisfaction. "Even in flats," she echoed, her fingers tapping lightly against the table. "I'll keep an eye out," Miguel continued. "You've got a good one in Noelle, she's solid. She'll help you keep the house in order." Eleanor paused for a moment, looking out the window. The world outside was quiet, as if it too was waiting for something. But there was no more waiting for her. The pieces were in motion, and everything was exactly as it should be. "Thanks, Miguel," she said softly, her voice warm despite the distance. "You've done your part. I'll take care of the rest." As she hung up the phone, she felt a ripple of contentment wash over her. Kendra could spin her web of lies and deceit all she wanted. But the truth was that Eleanor had already won. She had everything she needed. Everything was in place. Leon stood from his desk, his expression finally shifting into something more approving. "You've got this," he said. Eleanor's smile was small but knowing. "I always have." Eleanor sat at the kitchen table, the legal documents spread before her, the edges crisp and freshly signed. A stack of papers, all carefully prepared, each one designed with a quiet precision that could not be ignored. She ran a hand through her hair, staring down at the papers that would soon send a message that could not be undone. The house, the trust, everything she had fought for, was now in motion. The ball was no longer in their court. It had been a week since the dinner, a week since the shock had settled into the corners of their minds, and now Eleanor had decided it was time to make her next move. She knew what had to be done, the next step, the one that would make it all undeniably clear. She dialed Leon's number, her fingers moving with familiar purpose. The phone rang only once before his gravelly voice answered. "Eleanor." "I've got it ready," she said, the words simple but final. She held up the lease agreement, the one she had written up herself. Firm but fair. The rent she'd calculated was more than reasonable for the property, but to them, it would feel like a blow. Leon took a beat, then replied with a knowing tone. "All set on my end. I'll co-sign as trustee. It'll be official." Eleanor's lips curled into the faintest smile. It was time. "Good. I'll have the papers delivered to Ryan and Kendra's house this afternoon." The line went quiet for a moment. Then Leon added, "You sure they'll sign?" "They'll sign," Eleanor replied, her voice steady and unwavering. "They'll have no choice." Later that afternoon, Ryan and Kendra sat at their kitchen table, the heavy envelope placed between them like a weight they both understood but refused to acknowledge. The documents inside had been delivered with an impersonal coldness, the courier having left without so much as a word. But the words inside the envelope were enough to speak volumes. Ryan held the lease agreement, scanning it quickly. The numbers, the terms, the conditions? All of it felt more like a sentence than a proposal. A formal lease. For the house they had lived in for years, the house they thought was theirs, now reduced to a simple rental agreement. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the pages. The room was silent except for the faint sound of Kendra tapping her fingers against the table, her gaze flickering between Ryan and the documents in his hands. "This is," Ryan began, but his voice trailed off. He couldn't find the words to describe the shock, the disbelief, the anger rising inside him. "It's cruel," Kendra finally said, her voice tight, like she was choking on her words. This is how she's going to do it? This is her way of getting back at us?" Ryan let out a sharp breath, shaking his head. "She's done this on purpose. She's—" He stopped, his words caught in his throat as he looked again at the lease agreement. There, at the top, in bold print, was the deadline. 30 days to sign or vacate. "She's really doing it," Ryan muttered, the reality sinking in with a sickening heaviness. "She's making us pay to stay here." Kendra's eyes flashed with frustration, her hands gripping the edge of the table as she leaned forward. "We can't let her do this. We can't just sign this." She reached for the lease, her fingers brushing against the paper as though touching it would somehow make the reality go away. "This is our house. She can't—" Eleanor's voice echoed in Ryan's mind, as it had since that dinner. "I never loaned it to you. You've lived here under my terms, not yours." The words cut through him now with a clarity that felt almost too painful to endure. Ryan looked at Kendra, his expression hardening. "She's right. It was never our house. It was hers all along, and now she's making us pay rent." Kendra sat back, her eyes wide with disbelief, her mind racing. "But why?" Her voice cracked. "Why this? Why not just sell the house? Why make it so personal?" Ryan didn't answer immediately. He was staring at the lease now, but his thoughts were elsewhere. He knew why. It wasn't about the house. It wasn't about money. It was about control. About making sure they understood exactly who held the power, and that it would never be them again. "You said I should stop pretending it was mine," Eleanor's voice rang in his ears from that night. "So I did." Kendra rubbed her forehead, the reality settling over her like a weight she couldn't push off. "I can't believe she's doing this," she whispered, almost to herself. Ryan shook his head, his fingers tightening around the lease papers. "We're not signing this. I don't care if she's the one who owns it. We're not paying her rent. We're not doing this." Kendra looked at him, her eyes searching his face. "Ryan, what if we don't have a choice?" Before he could respond, the doorbell rang, its chime sharp in the silence. Kendra's gaze flicked toward the door and she stood up slowly, as if the sudden interruption could offer some kind of escape. She reached for the handle, but before she opened the door, she glanced back at Ryan, her expression unreadable. "I'm sure it's just someone delivering another damn thing for her," Kendra muttered, bitterness in her voice. Ryan, still gripping the papers in his hand, stared at the door as Kendra opened it. His heart sank in his chest as she stepped aside to reveal Noelle standing there, her posture tall, her expression calm but resolute. Noelle stepped into the house, her gaze immediately landing on Ryan and Kendra, the tension in the air as thick as it had ever been. She didn't need to say a word. The look on her face said it all. Kendra blinked, almost taken aback. "Noelle? What are you doing here?" Noelle didn't flinch. "Grandma told me you'd be having a discussion." She paused, letting the words sink in. "I'm here to help. With the next step." The morning light filtered through Eleanor's kitchen window, glinting off the freshly polished counter. The scent of coffee filled the air, rich and grounding. Noelle was perched on a step stool beside her, holding a paint sample fan deck in one hand, her face animated as she pointed to different shades of blue. The two had been up early, clearing shelves, moving furniture, and talking about new beginnings. Eleanor watched her granddaughter move about the room with youthful energy, and something inside her softened. The house, her house, was finally hers again. Not in theory, not in memory, but in every sense that mattered. And soon, it would carry the marks of their work, not the ghosts of Kendra's curated perfection. Her phone buzzed across the counter. She ignored it at first, but when it buzzed again, she glanced at the screen. Kendra. She hesitated, then answered, her tone neutral. Eleanor, Kendra began, skipping any pleasantries. I wanted to discuss the lease terms again. Eleanor set down her mug. There's nothing to discuss, she said evenly. Well, actually, there is. Kendra's voice was tight, rehearsed. We've looked over everything, and the rent you're asking for. It's just not feasible. Not with the market right now. We were hoping... She paused, her tone softening into something falsely sweet. You might consider reducing it. Just a bit. Eleanor smiled faintly, though there was no warmth behind it. No. Kendra blinked on the other end. Excuse me? I said no, Eleanor repeated. The rent is fair. In fact, it's below market. You can either pay it or move out. The choice is yours. For a moment, the line was silent except for the faint sound of Kendra's indignant breath. When she spoke again, her tone was sharper. I don't understand why you're doing this. You're acting like a landlord, not family. Eleanor took a slow sip of her coffee. Maybe that's what I should have been all along. Before Kendra could respond, Eleanor ended the call. The phone screen went dark, and for a brief second, Eleanor caught her reflection in it. Calm, unbothered, resolute. By that afternoon, it was Ryan's turn. He showed up at Eleanor's house unannounced, his car pulling up behind her Lexus. The sound of the engine cutting off shattered the calm of the quiet neighborhood. Eleanor was in the garden trimming the hydrangeas when he approached. He didn't even greet her before speaking. Mom, this has gone too far, Ryan said, his voice low but charged. You've made your point. But this... He gestured vaguely toward her house, as if the air itself carried accusation. This whole thing with the trust, the lease. It's not right. Eleanor kept pruning, methodically, each snip of the shears crisp and deliberate. What is it you want, Ryan? He stepped closer, lowering his tone. Add me to the trust. Eleanor froze for just a moment, her shears hovering over a flower before she snipped another stem. No. Ryan blinked, clearly not expecting her to respond so easily. What do you mean, no? I'm your son. I've been here for you. Eleanor cut him off, her tone sharp but calm. You've been here when it was convenient. You've treated what's mine as yours. You mocked me in front of your friends. You dismissed everything I built, and now you want to be part of what you thought you already owned. I won't allow it. Ryan's jaw clenched. This isn't just about money. Of course it is. Eleanor interrupted, meeting his gaze for the first time. It always is with you? He stood there for a moment, the silence stretching between them, filled only by the distant hum of traffic and the faint rustle of palm leaves in the breeze. When he finally spoke again, his voice had lost its force. You're really cutting us out. Eleanor set the shears down carefully on the table beside her. No, Ryan. You cut yourself out. That evening, as the sky deepened into dusk, Leon sent a brief email. Subject line, Final Boundary Notice. The body was simple. To the point. Effective immediately. No amendments or beneficiary additions can be made to the EM Living Trust without written consent from the trustee, Eleanor Masters, or her designated successor. Any attempts to challenge, reassign, or alter trust terms will be considered a violation of California Probate Code Section 15800. Leon Trevors, Esquire, trustee co-signer. Eleanor read the email once, nodded, and archived it. It was done. Days turned into weeks, and life at her house took on a lighter rhythm. Noelle spent her summer there, painting the guest room a cheerful pale yellow, hanging wind chimes on the porch, and baking in the kitchen with Eleanor. The air inside was different now, softer, freer. Eleanor's laughter, once rare, came more easily. The walls no longer echoed with memories of obligation, only choice. The holidays came quietly that year. Eleanor wrote her cards by hand, each one deliberate and thoughtful. There was one for Leon, for Miguel, for her neighbors, for Noelle's teachers. She sealed each envelope carefully, her handwriting looping across the paper with elegant precision. There was no card for Ryan, none for Kendra. She didn't even have to think about it. When she placed the last card in the outgoing mail stack, she caught a glimpse of her reflection in the kitchen window. Steady, self-contained, content. Outside, the evening light washed over her driveway, the faint metallic glint of her Lexus parked beneath the bougainvillea. It sat where it always had, faithful and unpretentious. Eleanor slipped her keys into the ignition and turned them. The engine purred to life immediately, smooth and strong, like it always had. She smiled to herself. Some things, the important things, still ran perfectly, no matter how old they were. The morning was quiet, save for the occasional hum of traffic drifting through the open window. Eleanor was sipping her coffee at the kitchen table, her mind drifting back to the way life had slowly unfolded since she'd taken control. She had been living in a peace she hadn't known in years, and the house, now her home in every way, had become a refuge, a place where she could finally be herself. No more expectations, no more drama, just calm. The sudden buzz of her phone interrupted her reverie. She glanced at the screen. It was from Miguel. She answered quickly. Miguel? Eleanor. Miguel's voice came through with its usual calm assurance. I just wanted to flag something for you. Eleanor set down her coffee, her eyes narrowing slightly. What's going on? There's been a submission at the DMV, Miguel said, his tone level. Someone tried to use your VIN for a donation, a charity, to be precise. Eleanor's heart tightened at the words. She didn't need to hear more. She knew exactly who had done it. Did they get the paperwork through? She asked, her voice controlled. No. I caught it in time, Miguel responded, his voice sharp with concern. But it's all tied back to Kendra. They've been trying to donate your Lexus. I've already reached out to the department, but I wanted to make sure you knew before things go further. Eleanor let out a slow breath, the anger building in her chest. This was no accident. This was intentional. Another attempt to undermine her control. Kendra had always been crafty, always finding ways to twist things to her benefit. But this was too far. I'll handle it, Eleanor said firmly. Thank you for letting me know. I'll keep an eye on things, Miguel offered. Don't worry, we've got it covered. After she hung up, Eleanor sat still for a moment, her thoughts focused. This wasn't just about a car. It was about trying to erase her choices, take from her what they couldn't control. It was about Kendra's need to feel like she could still win, even after everything was set in stone. Eleanor picked up the phone again, dialing Leon's number. Eleanor, he answered after a few rings, his tone immediately serious. I've got a report for you. I know about the donation paperwork, Eleanor said, her voice sharp. I need you to file a fraud report with the DMV. Kendra's trying to donate my Lexus. Leon was quiet for a beat before responding. "I'll take care of it. It's already on my radar. We'll get it sorted." Eleanor didn't need to hear more. Leon would handle the legal side, the professional side. The paperwork would be filed and the records would be locked. No one could take what was hers. No one would be able to manipulate her assets any longer. The next day, Eleanor had the Lexus detailed. She stood in the driveway, watching the workers buff the paint, polish the chrome, and vacuum the interior. It was all part of the plan. Part of her need to preserve what was hers, what she had worked for. The Lexus wasn't just a car. It was a symbol of control, of strength, of choice. She watched as the workers took photos of the car from every angle, documenting its condition. Every scratch, every dent was captured. She knew it would be part of the documentation for the trust. It wasn't just for her own peace of mind. It was a statement. Later that day, she uploaded the photos of the Lexus to her trust portal, labeling it clearly as one of her cover assets. The car wasn't just a car, it was another shield, another layer of protection. If Kendra thought she could take it, if she thought she could force Eleanor into submission, she would learn quickly that nothing slipped through her fingers anymore. Eleanor sat back at the kitchen table looking at the trust portal on her laptop. The Lexus, the house, everything that was hers was now officially part of the legal structure she had created. And as she hit submit to finalize the upload, a small, satisfied smile tugged at the corner of her lips. By evening, the letter from Leon arrived. She opened it carefully, her hands steady. The envelope contained a formal notice, the one Kendra would receive shortly. The letter stated, in no uncertain terms, that Kendra was to cease and desist any further attempts to alter, transfer, or dispose of any of Eleanor's assets. She was also reminded of the fraud charges that would be pursued if she continued trying to alter the vehicle's registration or engage in any further unauthorized actions. Kendra's arrogance had led her to believe she could bypass the boundaries Eleanor had carefully set. But now, the message was clear. Eleanor had eyes everywhere. She had the law on her side. Eleanor placed the letter back on the table, her hand resting lightly on the paper. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't an ultimatum. It was simply a statement of facts. Eleanor wasn't going to beg or plead. She had already given them the opportunity to do things right. Now she would simply enforce her boundaries. Kendra, of course, received the warning letter. She tried to call Eleanor twice in the following days, but Eleanor didn't pick up. Kendra's calls went straight to voicemail, each message more frantic than the last. She accused Eleanor of betrayal. She ranted about how she and Ryan had been done wrong, but Eleanor listened to none of it. Instead, Eleanor focused on the things that truly mattered, the things she had worked for, the things that couldn't be taken away, not by Kendra or anyone else. As she sat back in her armchair later that evening, she took a long, satisfied breath. She had done what needed to be done. Her Lexus, freshly detailed, was parked in the driveway. It would start on the first turn. It always did. And so would Eleanor. Eleanor stood by the window, the early afternoon sun casting a golden light over the backyard. She surveyed the setup. The table was neatly arranged under the pergola, white linen tablecloths billowing softly in the breeze, and small bouquets of fresh flowers scattered across the surface. The smell of freshly baked croissants and sizzling bacon wafted through the air, mingling with the soft hum of conversation from the neighbors and a few close friends she'd invited for brunch. It was the kind of gathering she hadn't hosted in years, but now it felt like exactly what she needed. The Lexus sat parked in the driveway, front and center, as if it were a subtle statement in and of itself. The sun gleamed off its polished surface, and the car seemed to glow in the daylight. It was the very thing that Ryan had mocked so many weeks ago, but now, in the presence of those who mattered, it stood tall. Not just a car, but a symbol. a symbol of everything she had reclaimed. The sound of laughter filled the air as her guests mingled, glasses of mimosas in hand. Eleanor felt an unexpected warmth rise in her chest as she took in the sight of her friends chatting and laughing, the sense of normalcy, of peace, surrounding her. Her life, for the first time in a long while, felt truly hers. No more pretense. No more people trying to pull the strings. Noelle moved about the patio, taking charge of the small details, ensuring that everything was just right. She smiled and laughed along with the others, but there was a quiet sense of pride in her that mirrored Eleanor's own. Noelle had grown into someone Eleanor could truly count on, and the bond they shared had only deepened in recent months. As Eleanor poured herself another glass of champagne, she felt the weight of the past few weeks melt away. The decisions had been made. The boundaries had been set. And now, it was time to enjoy the fruits of that labor. Guests continued to arrive, each one offering their own quiet compliments about the Lexus, admiring the car parked so prominently in front of the house. It was a subtle thing, but Eleanor couldn't help but notice how it caught people's attention. The car that had once been a symbol of ridicule was now a point of pride, and she took a quiet satisfaction in that. "It's a beauty," one of the neighbors said, as she sipped her mimosa. "I don't think I've seen a car that's kept so well." 20 years, Eleanor replied with a small smile. "I've always believed in taking care of things." The conversation moved on, but she could feel the eyes of others drifting toward the Lexus as it sat in the driveway, its polished surface catching the light. Suddenly, a car slowed down as it approached the house, and Eleanor felt a subtle shift in the air. Her eyes flicked toward the street, and she recognized the familiar black sedan rolling past, slow enough that she could see the tinted windows of Ryan and Kendra's car. They were driving by, but not stopping. Not even slowing to say hello. Eleanor's heart didn't skip a beat. She didn't need them here. Not anymore. Noelle stood beside her, a slight smile tugging at her lips as she followed her grandmother's gaze. "They know they're not welcome," she said softly, her voice carrying a certain satisfaction. Eleanor didn't respond immediately, but her lips curved into a small smile. She wasn't bothered by the slight. In fact, she felt more at ease knowing they had made the choice to stay away. It was a clear message, one that she didn't need to say out loud. Ryan's text came a few minutes later. A message that felt hollow, though she couldn't ignore the slight edge of resentment that tinged the words. She read it silently to herself before glancing at Noelle. "You made your point," Eleanor murmured, the words more of an observation than a response. She felt a lightness in her chest, as though the weight of their presence, their expectations, had finally lifted. Ryan's message wasn't a victory. It was the last gasp of someone who realized they had already lost. Noelle glanced down at her phone, her fingers tapping over the screen before she turned the device toward her grandmother. "I don't think they understand the point yet, though," she said, a flicker of something almost mischievous in her eyes. The message on Noelle's phone was brief, but its content was clear. "They're still trying to work things out. Ryan insists they have a right to the house." Eleanor read it, her lips curling slightly at the corners. "Let them try. There's nothing left for them to take." As Noelle slid her phone back into her pocket, Eleanor turned her attention back to the party. The guests were still chatting, still laughing, and she could feel the warmth of the moment settle over her like a soft, comforting blanket. There was no need to look over her shoulder anymore. She had reclaimed everything that was hers, and it was finally, irreversibly, hers to keep. The day drifted on, and Eleanor found herself watching the faces around her, her friends, her neighbors, even Miguel, who had come by for a quick drink. All of them smiling, their attention on the brunch, the good company, and the calm that had settled over everything. It was a normal day, a good day. And for the first time in what felt like years, Eleanor felt as though she had nothing more to prove. The Lexus, parked where it was, stood as a quiet but undeniable testament to everything she had rebuilt. Nothing would change that. The evening light was beginning to fade, casting long, slender shadows across the floor as Eleanor sat at her desk, the papers spread out before her. The world outside her window had gone quiet, and the hum of life beyond her home seemed distant, insignificant. She barely registered it anymore. Everything she cared about was right here, within these walls. She turned the thick stack of papers over, reviewing them one final time, ensuring everything was in its place. The transfer on death deed was the last step, the final line in a chapter she'd been writing for years. A single stroke, and it would all be hers, locked down, irrefutable. Leon had been by earlier in the day to finalize the paperwork. His presence was quiet but steady, a reassuring anchor in this final stretch of her plan. He'd seen it all through, always with a professionalism that made it easy to trust him. Easy to let him take care of the legalities while she handled the personal decisions. The hard part, the part she could claim for herself, was done. "Eleanor, it's legal," Leon had said, handing her the completed deed earlier that day. "Irrevocable, clean. No one can challenge this. Not Ryan, not Kendra, not anyone." Now, with the deed in her hands, Eleanor could almost feel the weight of the shift, the undeniable gravity of what it represented. It was one last step in the meticulous process of erasing the illusion that Ryan and Kendra had built around themselves. It wasn't just about the house or the Lexus. It was about sending a message that would echo through every future conversation, every attempt they made to claw back what they thought they deserved. She took a moment, letting the words sink in, and then she signed. The pen moved smoothly across the page, each stroke deliberate, a confirmation of what had already been set in motion. Noelle's name was written as the sole beneficiary. Eleanor had made sure of that. Ryan and Kendra? They were nowhere to be found on these documents. Eleanor felt the faintest smile tug at the corners of her mouth. This was the final act of defiance, the one that would truly leave them with nothing. Their names would be erased from this house, from her life, and from the future she was carefully crafting. She looked at the deed one more time, then placed it into the secure file. The trust had been updated with the new documents, Noelle now listed as the sole beneficiary of everything Eleanor held dear. The house, the Lexus, the accounts, all would skip a generation and go directly to Noelle. It was clean. It was final. It was theirs. Later that evening, Noelle came down to the study, her footsteps light but confident, as if she already understood what this all meant. She stood in the doorway for a moment, watching Eleanor with an understanding gaze. "You did it," Noelle said softly, as though the words were as much a statement as they were a question. Eleanor looked up from the papers, meeting her granddaughter's eyes. There was no uncertainty there, no hesitation. Noelle understood, and that was what mattered. "I did," Eleanor replied, her voice steady, almost quiet. She wasn't looking for affirmation. She wasn't looking for gratitude. She just needed Noelle to understand the weight of this moment, the enormity of what they had just secured. The house, the car, the assets. It was all Noelle's now. In time, she would understand the full scope of the choices Eleanor had made, the sacrifices she had endured to ensure Noelle would have everything she needed. But for now, there was a calmness in the way Noelle stood there. A quiet understanding that came from their shared history. "I've been thinking about the future," Noelle said, stepping into the room, her voice soft but sure. "And how I want to take care of this place, the house. Everything you've built." Eleanor smiled, a warmth in her chest. "You will. I know you will." Noelle gave a small nod before moving to the window, her gaze drifting out over the backyard. I'll make sure it's never taken for granted. The evening passed in a quiet, satisfied rhythm, with Eleanor preparing for the next day's errands and Noelle helping around the house. The weight of their work, the weight of what had been done, was settling in comfortably, but there was still a quiet hum in the air. The kind that only comes when a great shift is made. And in Eleanor's case, the shift was complete. The next morning, the paperwork was officially filed with the county, the transfer on death deed was recorded, and the change was now locked in the records. There was no going back, no way for anyone to reverse what had been done. Eleanor felt the finality of it, a sharp, undeniable sense of control. And as she walked through the house, her eyes taking in the familiar corners, the well-worn furniture, she realized something more. It wasn't just about the trust, or the house, or the Lexus. It was about freedom. The freedom to make decisions without fear. The freedom to live on her terms. And in that moment, Eleanor knew she had won. As she sat at the kitchen table reflecting on the morning's events, Eleanor's phone buzzed again. A message from Leon. Ryan and Kendra are moving out. Eleanor's eyes flickered to the screen, and for the first time in days she felt a sense of peace. They were gone. At last. For good. The house was quiet again, the kind of silence that felt different now, after everything had settled. The past few weeks had been a blur of legalities, decisions, and small victories, each one building toward this moment. Eleanor sat at the kitchen table, her fingers tracing the edges of the now empty papers that had once been her armor. The house was hers. The Lexus was hers. Noelle, as always, was the one constant. She had just finished another round of correspondence, the last of the official paperwork she'd needed to handle, when Noelle came into the room, a soft rustling of paper in her hands. It was a letter, a note, the kind that Eleanor hadn't seen in years, the kind that felt more personal than anything she had dealt with in a long time. Eleanor looked up, watching Noelle's eyes as she held the paper, her expression softening as she recognized the handwriting immediately. "It's from him," Noelle said quietly, her voice a little shaky. She set the note on the table, her hands clasped together, the weight of the words she had just read clearly settling in. Eleanor didn't need to ask who the letter was from. She already knew. Noelle picked it up again, her fingers trembling slightly as she unfolded the note. "It's from Grandpa," she said, her voice catching just a little. "It's for you, Grandma." Eleanor's heart tightened as she watched Noelle read the note silently. She knew what was in it before Noelle even said a word. She knew because she had felt it. The words were simple. Not much more than a few lines, but in them lay the story of everything she had worked for, of everything that had led her to this moment. "You always listened. Now it's yours." The words hung in the air for a moment, their weight settling in the space between them. Noelle's hands tightened around the paper as she tried to steady herself, but Eleanor could see the tears beginning to form in her granddaughter's eyes. Noelle wiped them away quickly, but Eleanor saw. She always saw. The emotion, raw and unspoken, was as clear as the glass of water sitting on the table between them. Eleanor stood, moving over to Noelle's side, the space between them filled only by the quiet hum of the house. "It's all yours, darling," Eleanor said, her voice soft but strong. "You've always listened, always understood." She paused, taking Noelle's hands in her own. "And now it's yours to take care of." Noelle smiled faintly, her lips trembling as she looked at Eleanor, her eyes glistening. There was something more there than just gratitude. There was a sense of peace, the kind that comes when you know you've been trusted with something important, something permanent. Eleanor stepped back and placed the note back on the table, careful not to disrupt the fragile weight of the moment. She motioned toward the door. "Come. I'll show you how to do it." Noelle raised an eyebrow, looking confused for a moment, and then understanding clicked. "The car?" she asked, her voice almost uncertain. "The Lexus," Eleanor said with a smile. "Time to teach you a few things." In the garage, the Lexus gleamed in the early evening light, its curves reflecting the stillness of the world outside. Noelle stood next to it, her hands lightly resting on the smooth metal of the hood. Eleanor was already kneeling beside the car, opening the hood with a practiced ease. She motioned for Noelle to join her. "Let's start with the basics," Eleanor said, her tone steady and calm as she guided Noelle through the steps of checking the oil. Noelle watched her closely, learning with a careful attention that came from a place of deep respect. Eleanor explained the process, showing her how to check the dipstick, how to interpret the oil levels, and why it was important to stay ahead of maintenance. It wasn't just about the car, though. Eleanor knew that. It was about teaching Noelle the value of taking care of what you had, of being responsible for the things that mattered. It was about showing her how to nurture the things you loved, whether they were cars, homes, or relationships. Noelle asked questions, listened intently, and Eleanor answered each one with a calm certainty, just as she had answered countless questions in the past. But this time, it felt different. Noelle wasn't just learning how to check the oil. She was learning how to care for what mattered, how to protect it. The drive to the coast was slow and peaceful, the kind of drive you take when you don't need to rush, when there's no destination other than the journey itself. Noelle was at the wheel, her hands steady on the wheel as Eleanor sat beside her, both of them silent for a moment, just taking in the world passing by. The cool breeze from the ocean cut through the open windows, carrying the scent of salt and freedom. There was no music playing, no distractions, just the sound of the wind, the hum of the tires on the road, and the quiet rhythm of their lives moving forward. As they passed a small stretch of road lined with cliffs, Eleanor saw Miguel standing by the roadside, his figure a silhouette against the horizon. He waved as they approached, his hand raised in a casual greeting. Noelle glanced at Eleanor, a small smile tugging at her lips as she returned the wave. "He's always watching, isn't he?" Eleanor smiled back, her gaze steady on Miguel. "Always." As they drove past, Miguel's figure grew smaller in the rearview mirror, his wave lingering just a little longer than usual. For a brief moment, Eleanor felt something shift in her chest. A quiet satisfaction. The past, the future, everything they had worked for. It was all unfolding in ways she had once only dreamed of. And Noelle, who had always listened, was now walking beside her, ready to take the next steps on her own. The DMV was quiet that morning, the fluorescent lights buzzing above, casting a sterile glow over the rows of plastic chairs and faded paperwork. Eleanor stood at the counter, her back straight, her presence as steady and sure as the walls that surrounded her. The final paperwork for the trust had been sealed and recorded. The last of the documents had been filed. Everything was in its place. She slid the completed forms back into the envelope, her fingers brushing against the edges with the same calm precision that had guided every decision she'd made in recent months. There were no more loose ends, no more questions. It was final. Eleanor knew, without a doubt, that there was no way back. As she turned to leave, her eyes scanned the room. A few people waited by the other counters, lost in their own thoughts, their own errands. No one seemed to notice her as she walked past. But Eleanor didn't need the recognition. She knew what she had done, and that was enough. Noelle stood outside, waiting for her by the car. Eleanor could see her granddaughter leaning against the Lexus, the car that had always been there. But now, in the sunlight, gleaming and perfect, it felt like more than just metal and leather. It was a symbol of everything she had fought for. And now, everything she would protect. Eleanor approached, the keys to the car slipping easily into her palm. Noelle's eyes met hers, the understanding between them unspoken. "Ready?" Eleanor asked, her voice steady but warm. Noelle nodded, a small smile playing on her lips as she handed Eleanor the spare Lexus key. "I think it's time for me to start taking care of things." Eleanor's hand lingered on the key for a moment. The weight of it a reminder of the responsibility they both carried. It wasn't just about the car or the house, it was about everything they had built together. The trust, the protection, the family that had been torn apart and was now, in some quiet way, starting to rebuild. Ryan and Kendra had moved out of the house by then, their belongings gone, packed up, and moved into a small rental outside of town. The house that had once been theirs, at least in their minds, now stood empty, the keys to the front door in Eleanor's hands. The silence in the house was different now. It was theirs. Eleanor had no need to see them off. She'd given them the chance to do things the right way, but they had squandered it. The house was now free of them, free of their expectations. And Eleanor felt a deep sense of relief in knowing it would never be theirs again. That evening, she sat on the porch with Leon, the tea between them steeping slowly in the cool evening air. The house behind them was quiet now, and the only sound that broke the silence was the faint hum of a distant lawnmower. The breeze rustled the leaves of the trees, a reminder of the steady rhythm of life that had begun again. "You know," Leon said, his voice measured but approving, "I still can't quite believe they pushed you this far." Eleanor glanced at him, her expression calm, almost amused. "It's not about belief, Leon. It's about knowing what's mine and making sure it stays that way." Leon nodded, his gaze moving to the car parked at the end of the driveway, still as immaculate as the day it had been detailed. "She drives it well," he said, his voice tinged with a quiet approval. Eleanor smiled softly, the corners of her mouth curving upward in that subtle way she had perfected over the years. "So did I." She didn't need to say anything more. They both understood the depth of that statement. Eleanor had driven the Lexus for years, and it had carried her through countless struggles, through battles that had shaped her into the woman she was now. It was hers, not just because of ownership, but because it had been a part of her life, a constant in a world that had often tried to push her down. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the world outside the house settled into the quiet of night, Eleanor sat back in her chair, her hands resting lightly in her lap. The feeling of finality was overwhelming, but not in the way it had once been. There was no tension now, no fear of what would come next. Everything had fallen into place. She took a long breath, savoring the silence. There was no more pretending, no more playing by anyone else's rules. The trust was set. The house was safe. And Noelle, her granddaughter, was ready to take the reins. Eleanor glanced at her phone, feeling the familiar buzz against her palm. She looked down and saw the message from Ryan. "You made your point." Her fingers tightened around the phone as she read the message again. The words were empty, but they still held a bite, a reminder of everything that had come before. Eleanor set the phone down and let out a small, satisfied breath. Her point had been made, and for the first time in a long time, she felt at peace. She stepped outside, her eyes drawn to the Lexus parked in the driveway. A faint glow from the streetlight illuminating it in the stillness of the night. It was hers. It always had been. The valet, Miguel, had returned the keys to her as the owner. As she stood there staring at the car, Eleanor felt a quiet satisfaction wash over her. The battle was over, and she had won. "My son mocked my old car in front of guests. The valet returned the keys to me as the owner.